The evening was drawing in, casting long shadows over the nearly empty train station. Grace, a woman in her early 40s with brown skin, wore a deep frown as she hurried down the platform, her coat wrapped tightly around her to ward off the cool breeze. She had missed her train, again. Her phone buzzed with a message from her husband, Evan, but she ignored it for the moment, too frustrated to respond. As she turned to find a place to sit, something caught her eye. A small figure huddled on a bench. At first glance, it seemed like an ordinary child waiting for a parent, but as Grace approached, she realized something was wrong. The girl, no more than 7 years old, had been sitting there for hours, her backpack pulled into her lap as if she were afraid it might disappear. Grace's maternal instincts kicked in immediately. "Hey, sweetheart," she said softly, crouching down. "Are you lost?" The child didn't respond. She looked up with wide, dark eyes, but said nothing. Grace frowned. There was something haunting in the girl's silence. She was clearly scared, and the ragged state of her clothes suggested neglect. Grace glanced around, but the platform was nearly deserted. Where was this child's family? Before we dive into this fascinating story, please share a comment with the community letting us know where you're watching from. After a few minutes of gentle coaxing, Grace learned nothing more about the girl's situation. No parent or guardian came forward, and the station workers claimed they hadn't seen anyone drop her off. An unease settled in Grace's stomach. It was getting late, and leaving this child alone in the cold, dim station seemed out of the question. But what was she supposed to do? Pulling out her phone, Grace called the police, explaining the situation as she kept an eye on the child, who remained motionless except for the nervous tapping of her foot. When she ended the call, she turned back to the girl. "What's your name, honey?" The girl stared at her with that same wide-eyed fear, clutching the old, worn photograph that had been peeking out of her backpack. Grace couldn't make out who was in the picture, but it looked old, maybe from years ago. She tried to offer a comforting smile, but the girl remained silent. "Don't worry," Grace murmured. "I won't leave you alone." After a long wait, a police officer finally arrived. He was young, and his expression softened as soon as he saw the little girl. Grace explained the situation again, but as the officer tried to talk to the girl, she remained as quiet as before, only gripping the photo more tightly. "She might be in shock," the officer suggested. "We can take her to child services. She'll be safe with them." Grace felt a pang at the idea of leaving the girl with strangers. "Is there any other option?" she asked hesitantly. It was a ridiculous question. She wasn't prepared to take care of a child. Yet, looking into the girl's eyes, something in Grace told her she couldn't just walk away. The officer, clearly stretched thin by his workload, sighed. "You could take her in temporarily if child services agrees. It's rare, but not impossible." Grace was taken aback. Her life was already chaotic enough. Yet the thought of the girl being shuffled between foster homes filled her with dread. "I'll take her tonight," she heard herself say, almost in disbelief. Later that night, Grace sat at her kitchen table, staring across at the girl, who was now wearing one of Grace's oversized sweaters, which hung loosely on her small frame. The girl hadn't said a word, even as Grace had prepared a simple meal for her. Evan was due home soon, and Grace didn't know how he would react to their new, temporary guest. "Do you like spaghetti?" Grace asked, trying to ease the awkward silence. The girl nodded slightly, but still didn't speak. It was clear she was still scared. Grace wanted to comfort her, but didn't know how. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Evan walked in. His face, usually full of warmth, turned to confusion as he saw the girl. "Who's this?" he asked, glancing between them. Grace stood up quickly, trying to explain everything in one breath. "I found her at the station. She was all alone, Evan. The police couldn't help much, so I brought her here for the night, just until we figure out what's going on." Evan's brow furrowed, but he said nothing at first. Finally, he sighed. "We'll talk more about this in the morning," he muttered, heading upstairs. Grace's stomach churned. She had a feeling tomorrow would bring more questions than answers. Later that night, unable to sleep, Grace sat on the couch beside the girl, who had finally dozed off. She carefully pulled the worn photograph from the child's grip. The image showed a smiling man in a suit, holding hands with a woman. The man looked strangely familiar. Grace squinted, trying to place his face. That's when it hit her. The man in the photo was Senator Richard Hartman, a name that had been in the news constantly for his upcoming re-election campaign. But why would this girl have a photo of him? Morning light filtered through the kitchen window as Grace prepared breakfast, her mind still racing after the discovery of the photograph. She could hear Evan moving around upstairs, but the little girl, Tara, she finally learned her name was Tara, remained quiet, sitting at the table, watching her every move. Evan joined them at the table, his face tense with worry. "Grace, we need to talk," he began, glancing over at Tara. He lowered his voice, but Tara's eyes never left him. "You can't just bring a child home without knowing anything about her. What if there's more going on here? What if it's dangerous?" Grace paused, stirring the eggs on the stove. She knew he was right, but something about the child's helplessness had tugged at her heart. "I couldn't leave her there," she whispered. "She has no one, Evan, and I found this." She placed the photograph on the table, watching his face shift from confusion to shock. Is that Senator Hartman?" Evan asked, incredulous. Grace nodded slowly. "What's his picture doing with her?" His question hung heavy in the air, and neither of them had the answer. Grace couldn't shake the image of the smiling politician in the photograph. She had never paid much attention to politics, but she knew Hartman's name. He was a wealthy, influential figure, someone who lived in a different world from hers and Evan's. But now, somehow, he was connected to the little girl sleeping upstairs. Determined to find out more, Grace spent the afternoon on her phone, researching Senator Richard Hartman. She found news stories about his career, his rise to political prominence, and his seemingly perfect family. A wife, 2 children, no mention of anything that could explain the presence of this abandoned girl. Then, she came across an old article, buried deep in the archives, mentioning a scandal, quickly hushed up, involving a young woman who had once worked as a housekeeper for Hartman's family. The woman had disappeared after a series of rumors surfaced, but no one had ever followed up on the story. Grace's heart pounded. Could Tara be the child of that woman? Was she connected to that scandal? That evening, after Evan returned from work, Grace shared what she had discovered. "I think Tara might be Hartman's daughter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Evan looked at her, incredulous. "Grace, you're talking about one of the most powerful men in the state. Do you know what this could mean?" Grace nodded, but her resolve had only grown stronger. "I have to do something." She was abandoned, Evan. If Hartman really is her father, how could he just leave her like this? Evan's expression softened. He reached out, taking her hand. "We need to be careful," he warned. "People like Hartman don't like their secrets coming out. This could get dangerous for all of us." Grace knew he was right, but she couldn't let this go. "I have to know the truth," she said firmly, for Tara. The next day, Grace made the bold decision to contact Hartman's office. She didn't tell Evan right away. She knew he would try to stop her. She explained to the secretary that she had found a child who might be connected to the senator, and after much back and forth, she was promised a call back. Hours passed, and Grace's nerves were frayed by the time her phone rang. When she answered, it wasn't the secretary on the other line. It was Senator Hartman himself. "What exactly is it that you think you know?" His voice was calm, but carried a weight of authority that sent a chill down Grace's spine. "I found a little girl," Grace began, her voice steady despite her fear. "Her name is Tara, and I believe she's your daughter." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Grace could hear Hartman breathing, the sound of papers shuffling. "I don't have a daughter named Tara," he finally said, but Grace could hear the lie in his voice. "You must be mistaken." Grace's hand tightened on the phone. "She has a photograph of you," she said, "with a woman who used to work for your family. You know who she is." Another pause. This time, when Hartman spoke, his voice was cold. "I don't know what you're trying to accomplish here, but I suggest you forget this ever happened." The conversation left Grace shaken, but she was more convinced than ever that she had stumbled upon something Hartman wanted to keep hidden. The next few days passed in a blur. Grace kept Tara close, unsure of what to do next. Then, one evening, just as they were sitting down to dinner, there was a knock at the door. Grace exchanged a worried glance with Evan. When she opened the door, she was greeted by two men in dark suits. "We're here on behalf of Senator Hartman," one of them said, his voice smooth but menacing. Grace's heart raced. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain calm. "We'd like to speak with you about the child," the man said, stepping closer. "This is a private matter, and we suggest you handle it accordingly." Evan appeared beside her, his face hardening as he stepped in front of Grace protectively. "We have nothing to say to you," he growled. "Now get off our property." The men exchanged a glance, then handed Grace a business card. "If you change your mind, give us a call," the man said, before turning and walking away. After the men left, Grace sat down, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "They're trying to scare us," she murmured, her voice shaky. Evan wrapped his arms around her. "We're in too deep now," he said quietly. "What are we going to do?" "I don't know," Grace admitted, her mind racing. "But I can't give her up. I can't let them take her." Tara appeared in the doorway, her small frame casting a long shadow in the dim light. She looked at Grace with wide, fearful eyes, and for the first time since she had come into their home, she spoke. "Please don't let them take me." Grace's heart broke in that moment. She knelt down in front of Tara, taking her small hands in hers. "I won't," she promised. "I'll protect you, no matter what." The encounter with Hartman's men had rattled Grace, but it had also steeled her resolve. She needed to find out the full truth about Tara's past, and she couldn't do it alone. Reluctantly, she called a lawyer, explaining the situation and asking for advice on how to proceed. The lawyer warned her that going up against someone as powerful as Hartman would be risky, but he also agreed to help. "If this girl really is his daughter, he has a legal obligation to her," the lawyer explained, "but proving it won't be easy." Grace knew the odds were against them, but she wasn't going to give up. Tara deserved the truth, and Grace was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. The weight of the situation grew heavier with each passing day. Tara had grown more comfortable with Grace and Evan, but the looming threat of Senator Hartman's reach was ever present. Grace knew that the longer they waited, the more dangerous it became. With the lawyer's advice still fresh in her mind, she made the decision. They would confront Hartman directly. After a sleepless night, Grace dialed the number on the business card Hartman's men had left behind. Her heart pounded in her chest as she waited for the voice on the other end. When it finally picked up, Grace was ready. "I want to meet with Senator Hartman," she said, her voice firm. "Face to face. If he refuses, I'll go to the press." There was a pause, followed by a low, cautious voice. "You don't want to do that, Mrs. Coleman." Grace's pulse quickened. "I'll give you 24 hours, she said, ignoring the warning. "If I don't hear from him by then, the story goes public." The line went dead. Grace exhaled, her hands shaking as she placed the phone on the table. It was a dangerous move, and she knew it, but there was no turning back now. The next morning, Grace received a call. Hartman had agreed to meet her, alone. He gave her an address, a private estate far from the public eye. Grace's lawyer advised her against going, but she couldn't let this opportunity slip away. Evan was furious when she told him, "Grace, you can't go. What if it's a trap? You don't know what he's capable of." "I have to," Grace insisted. "For Tara, we need answers, Evan." Reluctantly, Evan agreed to stay home with Tara while Grace went to the meeting. Before she left, he pulled her into a tight embrace. "Be careful," he whispered, his voice thick with worry. Grace drove to the estate, her mind racing with 100 different scenarios. When she arrived, two men stood by the gate waiting for her. They escorted her inside to a grand but eerily quiet living room. There, seated in a leather chair, was Senator Richard Hartman himself. Hartman looked different than he did in the photograph, older, more weathered. His eyes held none of the warmth seen in the picture Tara clutched so tightly. He gestured for Grace to sit across from him, his face a mask of indifference. "You wanted to meet," he said, his voice low and measured. "What do you want?" Grace swallowed the knot in her throat. "I know who you are, and I know who Tara is." Hartman's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, in his eyes. "Tara is not my child," he said flatly. "You're mistaken." Grace leaned forward, her voice rising. "Then why does she have a photograph of you? Why was she left alone with nothing but that picture?" If she's not your daughter, explain that to me. Hartman remained silent for a long moment, his eyes locked on hers. Then, with a heavy sigh, he spoke. Her mother was someone who worked for me, years ago. It was a mistake, one I've spent years trying to forget. His voice was cold, detached, as if he were discussing a business transaction, not a child. She was never supposed to be a part of my life, Hartman continued, his gaze hardening. Her mother knew that. When she passed away, I did what I had to do. It's not my responsibility. Grace's heart clenched. How could someone be so heartless? You abandoned your own child, she whispered, anger surging through her. You left her to fend for herself. You're a monster. Hartman's face darkened. I suggest you be very careful with your words, Mrs. Coleman. You don't know what's at stake here. Grace's fury only grew. You think you can just make this go away? She's your daughter, Hartman. You owe her more than this. I'm not going to let you bury this. Hartman stood up, towering over her. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper. You have no idea what you're getting into. If you push this, it will destroy not just me, but you, your husband, and that little girl you care so much about. Grace's breath caught in her throat. This was no longer just about Tara, it was about protecting her family. But she couldn't back down, not now. I'm not afraid of you, she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. I'll go public if I have to. Hartman's eyes narrowed. You'll regret it.
Hey there, quick message. Grab a paper, write down HeroKind Stories, our channel name. Come back soon, we've got incredible stories you won't want to miss.
The tension in the room was suffocating. Grace stood her ground, refusing to let Hartman intimidate her. After what felt like an eternity, Hartman finally backed down, his face twisted with anger. Fine, he spat. You want the truth? You'll have it. He pulled out a folder from a drawer in the desk and tossed it onto the table. This is everything. Her birth certificate, the settlement I paid her mother, everything you need to ruin my career. But if you go down that path, don't think for a second that I'll go quietly. Grace grabbed the folder, her hands shaking. She had what she needed, but at what cost? The threat in Hartman's voice was real. If she exposed him, there would be consequences. She had no doubt about that. As Grace drove home, her mind raced. She had the proof, but the decision weighed heavily on her. If she went public, Hartman would retaliate. He had the power to ruin their lives, and she wasn't sure if they could survive that. When she got home, Evan was waiting, his face tense with worry. What happened? He asked, his voice urgent. Grace handed him the folder, too exhausted to explain. Evan opened it, his eyes scanning the documents. His face paled. This is it, he whispered. This proves everything. But what do we do? Grace asked, her voice shaking. If we go to the press, Hartman will come after us. He's not bluffing, Evan. Evan sat down, running a hand through his hair. We need to think about Tara, he said quietly. What's best for her? Is exposing this worth the risk? As they sat in silence, Tara appeared in the doorway, clutching the same photograph of her mother and Hartman. She looked up at Grace with wide, tear-filled eyes. I don't want him, Tara said softly, her voice trembling. I don't want him to be my dad. He doesn't love me. Grace's heart broke at the words. She knelt in front of Tara, pulling her into a tight embrace. You don't need him, Tara, she whispered. You have us. Tara sniffled, burying her face in Grace's shoulder. Will you protect me? She asked, her voice small. Grace felt a surge of determination. Always, she promised, no matter what. That night, after putting Tara to bed, Grace and Evan made their decision. They couldn't expose Hartman, not yet. The risk was too great, and Tara's safety came first. But they also couldn't let him get away with abandoning his daughter. They needed a plan, one that would protect Tara without destroying their lives. We'll keep the documents, Grace said, her voice firm. If Hartman tries to come after us, we'll use them. But for now, we focus on Tara. Evan nodded, his expression resolute. We protect her, no matter what. Weeks passed, and the tension that had gripped Grace and Evan's home slowly began to ease. Tara had settled into her new life with them, her trust growing stronger each day. There were still moments of fear in her eyes, shadows of her past that Grace couldn't erase, but Tara had begun to smile more often. Small, tentative smiles that broke Grace's heart each time. Grace and Evan had agreed not to confront Senator Hartman, at least for now. They kept the folder of documents hidden in a safe place, knowing that it was their only protection if Hartman ever made a move against them. But for the moment, there was silence from his side. No more threatening visits, no more phone calls. It was as if the storm had passed, but Grace knew better. It was only a matter of time before Hartman would try something. One evening, after tucking Tara into bed, Grace sat down with Evan at the kitchen table. "Do you think we made the right decision?" she asked quietly. Evan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, but I do know that we're doing what's best for her. We're giving her a chance at a life without fear." Grace nodded, though the weight of the secrets they were keeping still pressed down on her. "We have to be ready," she said, "in case he comes after us." Evan's jaw tightened. "We will be." The next day, as Grace was driving home from the grocery store, her phone rang. It was an unknown number, but something told her to pick up. "Hello? Mrs. Coleman?" The voice on the other end was soft, hesitant. "My name is Cynthia Hartman. I'm Richard Hartman's wife." Grace's heart skipped a beat. She pulled the car over, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice cautious. "I know about Tara," Cynthia said, her voice breaking slightly. "I found out everything." Grace was speechless. How much did she know, and what did she want? "I'm not calling to threaten you," Cynthia continued quickly. "I'm calling because I need to meet with you. There are things you don't know, things that Richard has done. Please, I need to help you and Tara." Grace's mind raced. Could she trust her? This could easily be a trap, another way for Hartman to manipulate the situation. But there was something in Cynthia's voice, desperation, maybe, that made Grace hesitate. "Why should I believe you?" "Because I'm leaving him," Cynthia said, her voice firm. "And I want to make things right, for Tara and for myself." 2 days later, Grace met Cynthia in a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Cynthia was nothing like Grace had imagined. She was a fragile woman, with dark circles under her eyes and a nervous energy that made her look over her shoulder every few minutes. "I found the documents," Cynthia began, her hands trembling as she sipped her tea. "The settlement, the birth certificate. I didn't know about any of it until recently. Richard has been lying to me for years." Grace listened, her skepticism slowly melting away as Cynthia shared her story. She had been trapped in a loveless marriage for years, controlled by Hartman's power and influence. She had known about the affairs, but not about Tara. "I'm leaving him," Cynthia repeated, her voice stronger now. "But I need your help. I can't do this alone. If we expose him together, we can protect Tara." Grace felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly doused by fear. "If we expose him, he'll come after us," she said. "You know that." Cynthia nodded. "I know, but I have resources. I can help you. We can do this carefully, legally. I just want to make sure Tara is safe." Over the next few weeks, Grace and Cynthia worked together in secret, building a case against Hartman. They gathered evidence, Cynthia's testimony, financial records, and the documents that proved Tara's connection to Hartman. Grace had never imagined herself in a situation like this, fighting a powerful politician to protect a child she had grown to love as her own. But now, there was no turning back. Evan was nervous, but supportive. "If this is what you think is right, then I'm with you," he told her one evening as they sat together in the living room. Tara was playing quietly nearby, her laughter filling the room with a warmth Grace hadn't felt in months. "We're doing this for her," Grace said softly, watching Tara. "She deserves to know the truth, and she deserves to be safe." The day finally came. Grace, Cynthia, and their lawyer sat in a conference room, waiting for Hartman to arrive. He had been served legal papers the day before, and the meeting was set to negotiate a settlement before they went public with the story. Grace's heart pounded in her chest as the door opened, and Hartman walked in, flanked by his own legal team. He looked at Grace with a cold, unreadable expression. "You've made a mistake," he said, his voice low. "You think you can win this, but you don't know what you're up against." "We know enough," Cynthia said, her voice strong despite the tension in the room. "We have the truth, and we're not afraid to use it." Hartman's eyes flicked toward his wife, and for the first time, Grace saw something crack in his facade. "You won't win," he said quietly, but there was less conviction in his voice now. The negotiations were intense, but in the end, Hartman was forced to agree to a settlement. he would relinquish his parental rights to Tara, and in exchange, Grace and Cynthia would keep the details of his affair and abandonment of his daughter out of the press, for now. Months passed, and life began to settle into a new normal. Tara, now officially adopted by Grace and Evan, was thriving. She had started school, made friends, and seemed to be leaving the shadows of her past behind. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset, Tara looked up at Grace and smiled. "I love you, Mommy," she said softly. Grace's heart swelled with emotion. "I love you too, baby," she whispered, pulling her close. Evan joined them, wrapping his arms around both of them as they watched the fading light. For the first time in months, Grace felt at peace. They had faced a powerful enemy, uncovered painful truths, and come out stronger on the other side. But she knew deep down that Hartman was still out there, watching, waiting. And while they had won this battle, the war wasn't over. Thank you for watching this powerful story of love, resilience, and courage. If you found this story as moving as we did, please subscribe to our channel and share this video with others who need to hear it. Be sure to watch the next video appearing on your screen now. It's another incredible story of triumph in the face of adversity, and we know you won't want to miss it.